My friends, there are moments in history when the air itself feels heavier when a single morning changes the course of a nation. For the people of Burkina Faso, that morning came without warning. The low hum of jet engines in the Sahel sky became a deafening roar. At precisely 5:42 a.m., two precision-guided missiles struck a rural outpost in the northern province of Yatenga. In seconds, 3 lives were gone. 2 soldiers, 1 civilian, and a vital communications tower lay in twisted metal. This was not an accident, not a misfire, not a joint operation gone wrong. According to Burkina Faso's Ministry of Defense, the strike originated from U.S. AFRICOM assets stationed hundreds of miles away in Niger. No call was made, no warning was given, no permission was sought. Under international law, it was a clear violation of sovereignty, a message many believe was meant to intimidate a small, proud nation for daring to chart its own independent course. But intimidation was not what spread that day. In Ouagadougou, the beating of drums began. In Bamako, flags were raised. In Conakry, candles were lit. Across the continent, something older and deeper than fear was awakening unity, defiance, and a determination to guard Africa's dignity. Is this the dawn of Africa's long-awaited awakening, or simply another chapter in the long, bitter book of foreign domination? For Burkina Faso's young leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the answer will define not only his presidency, but the very idea of African sovereignty in the 21st century. If you believe that the story of Africa should be written by Africans, stay with me until the end. We will uncover what happened, why it matters, and how this moment could redraw the balance of power between Africa and the world. Please share if you feel you are one of the first to stand with President Ibrahim Traoré. And subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. The day began like any other in northern Burkina Faso. Farmers in Yatenga province were already tending to their fields. In the cool dawn, soldiers at a small rural outpost monitored their radios, and the village's children prepared for school. Then, without warning, the stillness was torn apart. Over the horizon, the faint vibration of jet engines grew into a sky-shaking roar. At precisely 5:42 a.m., local time, 2 precision-guided munitions descended from the clouds. In a flash of light and dust, the outpost was obliterated. Shrapnel tore through sandbag walls, collapsing the communications tower that linked dozens of northern security posts. Within minutes, the local medical team confirmed the worst: 3 dead, 2 soldiers, 1 civilian, and 7 more wounded. Among the injured was a young radio operator whose last transmission was cut mid-sentence. The Ministry of Defense moved quickly. In its first statement, officials declared the strike originated from U.S. AFRICOM assets based in Niger, roughly 380 miles away. This was not a defensive action, they insisted. It was a unilateral military strike carried out without consultation or permission, an explicit violation of Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, which protects the sovereignty of member states. No explanation came from Washington in those first tense hours, but in Ouagadougou, the government's response was immediate and decisive. President Ibrahim Traoré appeared live on national television, his voice steady, his gaze unflinching. This strike, he declared, was not merely against our land. It was against our right to exist as a free and independent people. Within minutes, Burkina Faso's 12,000 active duty soldiers were placed on high alert. Along the porous frontiers with Mali and Niger, 200 additional troops were deployed to reinforce checkpoints and patrol routes. Strategic defense sites, including the Ouagadougou Air Base and the Ouagadougou Garrison, were ordered to DEFCON 2 readiness, the second highest level of military alert. This was not just about preventing another attack, it was about sending a message Burkina Faso would not be an easy target. If the intention of the strike was to intimidate, the public reaction suggested the opposite. By nightfall, an estimated 35,000 citizens had gathered in Ouagadougou's Revolution Square. Some waved the red-green flag of Burkina Faso, others carried handmade signs reading, "Our land, our right, our future." Drums echoed through the crowd, chants rose into the night, and the air crackled with defiance. From the capital to remote villages, radios broadcast continuous updates. Across West African social media, the rallying cry spread in Bambara, Fulfulde, French, and English. Africa News carried live coverage, while stations in Dakar and Nairobi hosted urgent panel discussions dissecting the meaning of the attack. In neighboring capitals, the shock was immediate. Mali, Niger, and Guinea nations that had recently distanced themselves from Western military alliances issued joint condemnations within hours. Senegal and Ghana, traditionally more aligned with U.S. policy, urged Washington to explain itself and reaffirm respect for African sovereignty. On the streets of Bamako, 50,000 demonstrators marched down Independence Avenue, waving both Malian and Burkinabe flags. In Conakry, Guinea, mourners lit candles outside the Burkinabe embassy. Even in Nairobi, where ties with Washington run deep, small but vocal groups gathered in solidarity. Within 18 hours of the attack, the African Union convened one of the fastest emergency sessions in its history. Foreign ministers from 42 African nations attended a virtual summit. When President Traoré's image appeared on the giant screen in Addis Ababa, his words were deliberate. If the sovereignty of one African nation can be violated without consequence, then none of us are safe. Burkina Faso will not stand alone, and I believe neither will you. For many watching, this was more than a political statement. It was the first domino in what could become a continent-wide shift. The stage was set for Africa's leaders to decide, would this be remembered as a moment of unity or another chapter of silent endurance? In the early hours after the missiles struck, Burkina Faso's wounds were still raw, but by the next morning the shockwaves had reached the marble halls of the African Union in Addis Ababa. In an extraordinary show of urgency, the AU called an emergency session one of the fastest in its history. 42 African nations were represented in a virtual summit. The air was tense, each foreign minister acutely aware that what had happened in Yatenga could just as easily happen in their own country. When President Ibrahim Traoré's face appeared on the towering screens, there was no mistaking the gravity of the moment. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of history. If the sovereignty of one African nation can be violated without consequence, then none of us are safe. Burkina Faso will not stand alone, and I believe neither will you. It was a challenge and a call to arms, not for war, but for unity. While diplomats deliberated in conference rooms, the real heartbeat of the continent was pounding in the streets. In Bamako, Mali, 50,000 demonstrators flooded Independence Avenue, their chants echoing through the city. An injury to one is an injury to all. In Conakry, Guinea, thousands held a candlelight vigil outside the Burkinabe embassy, the glow of each flame honoring the 3 lives lost in Yatenga. Even in Nairobi, Kenya, a city often aligned with U.S. policy, small but fierce groups of citizens marched holding signs that read, "Africa for Africans." Social media lit up with the now viral slogan born in Ouagadougou, "Our land, our right, our future." African radio call-in shows buzzed with unprecedented energy. Listeners from Lagos to Lusaka debated the meaning of the strike. Was this a deliberate show of force meant to frighten other nations away from breaking with Western security arrangements? Or had Washington miscalculated, underestimating the depth of Africa's collective memory of foreign domination? On television, analysts began to float a bold proposal: the creation of a joint African Rapid Reaction Force, a military alliance capable of deterring and, if necessary, responding to any external military aggression. The idea wasn't new, but in this moment it carried a sense of urgency like never before. One Nigerian defense scholar summed it up: what happened to Burkina Faso today could happen to us tomorrow. Unity is no longer a dream, it's survival. In Washington, the mood shifted from quiet confidence to damage control. Within 24 hours of the strike, the Pentagon held a press conference framing the operation as a targeted counter-terrorism mission against a militant cell allegedly operating in northern Burkina Faso. They cited credible intelligence of imminent threats to U.S. assets in the Sahel. But when pressed for specifics, names, dates, photographs, officials offered none. Burkina Faso's ambassador to the United Nations wasted no time requesting an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council. The session lasted over 3 hours, marked by heated exchanges. Russia and China openly condemned the strike as a violation of a sovereign member state. France, caught between its alliances and its shrinking influence in West Africa, urged restraint on all sides, a position many Africans read as hedging to protect its own strategic interests. From this diplomatic storm, unlikely partnerships began to emerge. Algeria and South Africa, countries that rarely aligned on military matters, issued a joint statement supporting Burkina Faso's right to self-defense. Outside Africa, Brazil and Malaysia expressed concern about the precedent such unilateral military actions could set. The African diaspora also mobilized. In Paris, London, and New York, Pan-African activist groups organized rallies. Speakers invoked the ghosts of colonialism, accusing the U.S. strike of being the same old control in a modern military uniform. In Burkina Faso's capital, the mood was a strange mix of vigilance and pride. The city had become both a fortress and a rally ground. Military checkpoints sprang up on major roads. Soldiers' rifles slung across their chests guarded government buildings, airports, and communications hubs. And yet every evening in Revolution Square, citizens continued to gather, not in fear, but in solidarity. To them, Ibrahim Traoré was no longer just their president. He was becoming a continental symbol of resistance. This was the point where a local tragedy had transformed into a Pan-African rallying cry. The strike meant to intimidate had instead set the stage for a geopolitical shift, one that neither Washington nor its allies could easily reverse. In the days following the strike, Burkina Faso found itself walking a tightrope, balancing national pride with the sobering realities of security, economics, and public trust. Ouagadougou, usually a city of bustling markets and motorbike traffic, now carried the aura of a garrison town. Military checkpoints appeared on every major road. Soldiers in camouflage rifles slung over their shoulders stood guard at government ministries' communications hubs and the capital's small but strategic airport. The Ministry of Defense confirmed that over 4,000 additional security personnel had been deployed nationwide. Patrols in the north were reinforced not only to deter another strike, but also to reassure communities living in the shadow of the attack site. The economic impact was swift and unforgiving. In just 1 week, the price of diesel fuel rose by 12%, driven by fears of disrupted supply chains from neighboring countries. In the northern provinces closest to Yatenga, food prices spiked by 8 to 10%, adding pressure to families already living on the edge. Traders in Ouagadougou reported delays in grain deliveries, while market vendors complained that customers were buying less, hoarding cash in anticipation of tougher days ahead. The Ministry of Trade announced emergency price controls on key imports like grain, cooking oil, and fuel. Traoré's government moved quickly to avoid panic buying, but the message was clear. This was not just a military incident. It was a national stress test. In Ouagadougou, near the strike zone, schools closed for 2 days as parents kept their children home. Some feared further airstrikes. Others simply didn't trust that the danger had passed. Local radio hosts fielded dozens of calls from anxious citizens asking the same question: what protections are in place if this happens again? Community leaders, religious figures, and veterans were dispatched to hold public forums explaining the government's defense posture and encouraging resilience. Still, the unease lingered, proof that the trauma of a sudden foreign attack can't be erased with a single speech. While the fear was real, so too was a surge in political unity, at least for the moment. Polls conducted by the Ouagadougou Institute of Public Opinion showed Traoré's approval rating jumping from 62% to 78% in the immediate aftermath. The image of a young leader standing firm against a global superpower resonated deeply with a population long accustomed to having their national destiny dictated from abroad. Civil society groups, while broadly supportive, began to push for transparency. They demanded details on the intelligence that Washington had used to justify its strike and urged the government to release any findings from Burkina Faso's own investigation. One prominent lawyer put it bluntly: "Our sovereignty is sacred, yes, but our government must defend it with truth, not only with rhetoric." The strike also reshaped the political landscape. Opposition parties, often critical of Traoré's military-led government, temporarily closed ranks, issuing joint statements of national solidarity. Lawmakers fast-tracked discussions on new legislation to strengthen Burkina Faso's air defense capabilities and review all foreign military agreements. At the same time, international diplomacy became a central domestic issue. State-run television broadcast nightly updates not only on troop deployments and humanitarian aid, but also on ongoing diplomatic talks with regional and global partners. For many Burkinabe, the attack would be remembered in two ways: as a moment of vulnerability and as a rallying cry. Vulnerability because it showed that even in the modern era, a small African nation could be struck without warning. A rallying cry because the response both in the streets and in the halls of power proved that fear was not the only possible reaction. In the end, the strike had done more than destroy a communications tower or claim 3 lives. It had rewired the national conversation. Burkina Faso was no longer just debating economic reform or counter-terrorism strategy. It was now openly confronting the larger question of what sovereignty truly means when faced with the reach of foreign power. In Washington, the Burkina Faso strike quickly shifted from a classified operation to a public controversy. Inside the Pentagon, officials clung to their narrative. This was a targeted counter-terrorism mission aimed at preventing an imminent attack on U.S. assets in the Sahel. Yet, behind closed doors, senior military advisors admitted what diplomats already feared: no prior consultation had been made with Burkina Faso or the African Union. That omission sparked concern in Congress. The Senate Armed Services Committee demanded a closed-door briefing, while members of the Foreign Relations Committee warned that striking sovereign nations without consent was not only a moral hazard, but a strategic one. Senator Mark Rutledge of Illinois put it bluntly: if we are conducting military strikes in sovereign nations without their consent, we are treading a dangerous path, not just morally, but strategically. For Washington's traditional allies, the incident was awkward. France, already struggling with dwindling influence in the Sahel, called for restraint, avoiding direct criticism of the U.S., but also refraining from unconditional support. Germany and Italy expressed measured concern, with Berlin warning that military partnerships cannot survive without trust. In contrast, Russia and China seized the opportunity to project themselves as defenders of African sovereignty. Moscow's foreign ministry denounced the strike as neo-imperialism in uniform, while Beijing framed it as proof that Western security guarantees are conditional and self-serving. Both hinted at deepening military and economic cooperation with Burkina Faso. The media battle lines were just as clear. In the United States, major networks like CNN and Fox News focused heavily on the alleged extremist threat. Outlets such as NPR and The Intercept questioned the legality and wisdom of the strike, pointing to a pattern of U.S. military overreach in Africa. In Europe, newspapers like Le Monde and The Guardian explored whether the incident would accelerate African nations' pivot away from Western alliances. But in Africa, the coverage was unanimous. Sovereignty was the central issue. African news channels replayed Traoré's defiant speeches on loop, interspersed with footage of massive crowds rallying in the streets. Commentators accused Western outlets of downplaying the continental solidarity now unfolding. From this shifting landscape, a tangible geopolitical change began to take shape. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger formalized the Sahel Shield Alliance, pledging mutual defense against any foreign military aggression conducted without the host nation's consent. For U.S. military planners, this was a troubling development. Such a bloc could complicate intelligence sharing, restrict access to forward operating bases, and open the door for non-Western powers to fill the security vacuum. For Africa, it was a statement of intense security for Africans by Africans. The Burkina Faso strike became more than a regional flashpoint. It was a test of how much influence Washington still held in Africa. For the first time in years, multiple African governments publicly aligned against a U.S. military action, and even friendly capitals began to question the wisdom of hosting foreign bases without stricter oversight. To some in the West, it was a miscalculation. To many in Africa, it was a turning point. And to President Ibrahim Traoré, it was confirmation that the path to sovereignty would not be granted. It would be taken step by step, alliance by alliance. What began as 2 missiles in the early morning sky over Yatenga became something no war planner in Washington had intended: a spark that lit fires of unity across a continent. In villages and capitals alike, the conversation shifted. No longer was the question whether Burkina Faso could withstand external pressure. The question became, how many African nations are willing to stand together to stop it from happening again? History tells us that moments like these are crossroads. One path leads to silent submission and the slow erosion of sovereignty. The other demands risk, resilience, and the courage to redefine a nation's place in the world. President Ibrahim Traoré chose the second path. He did not ask for this confrontation, but when it came to Burkina Faso's doorstep, he refused to bow. In doing so, he forced Africa and the world to confront a truth long ignored: sovereignty is not a gift, it is a line you draw and dare others to cross. Already the impact is spreading. The Sahel Shield Alliance is more than ink on paper. It's the first sign that Africa may be ready to build security frameworks outside of Western control. Protests in Nairobi, vigils in Conakry, joint statements from Algeria to South Africa — these are the tremors before a potential geopolitical shift. But with each tremor comes danger. History also warns that leaders who challenge entrenched power often face more than political isolation. They face destabilization, economic pressure, even covert attempts to remove them from power. For Traoré, the real battle may be just beginning. And so, my friends, this is no longer just a story about Burkina Faso. It is a mirror held up to the entire African continent and, in truth, to the world. How many times have nations been told that their security depends on someone else's army? How many times have people been told that their dignity is secondary to another country's strategic interests? Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective yet? Or is it time to prepare for someone else to continue the mission? If you believe that Africa's sovereignty is not negotiable, if you believe that the story of a continent should be written by those who live on its soil, speak its languages, and dream its future, then this is your moment to stand. Please share if you feel you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. Because in the end, this is not just about Burkina Faso's survival, it's about a world where no nation has to ask permission to be free.